This is a special report from ABC News Digital.
Hello, I'm Ty Hernandez in New York with this ABC News Digital special report. A new Senate intelligence report says the attack on the U.S. consulate in Benghazi that killed 4 Americans, including U.S. Ambassador Christopher Stevens, could and should have been prevented. The bipartisan report blaming both the State Department and the intelligence agencies for failing to increase security at the compound despite multiple warnings. To help us break down this report, let's bring in ABC's Louis Martinez at the Pentagon. Good morning, Louis, or good afternoon, I should say. Let's go through this step by step. What were the warnings the State Department apparently should have heeded?
Well, the warning signs, Ty, were that there were incidents of violence in Benghazi targeting Western interests. Some of them being diplomatic missions, like the consulate itself that went through 2 attacks, one in April and one in June of that year. The attack that we're talking about took place on September 11th of 2012. But there was the reports of violence. It should have been tripwires, like you said, that should have raised awareness within the State Department that security needed to be raised. Also, there were warnings by the intelligence community that the State Department received, as also shared by the Joint Staff here at the Pentagon, that there was the targeting of Western interests in Benghazi. And yet, despite that, the State Department didn't ramp up the security. Though interestingly enough, we've heard about the CIA annex that was there in Benghazi. The CIA ramped up their security as a result of those attacks. Another thing that's come under questioning here is what happened in the follow-up. Of course, a lot of blame that in the aftermath of the attack, that this may have been prompted by a protest against an anti-Islamic video that had raised protests in Egypt and had spread over to Libya. The Intelligence Committee here calling to task the Intelligence Committee itself for not having checked out the veracity of the open source information that prompted it to kind of steer the narrative that way.
Okay, now you mentioned the CIA compound on that site as well, and that the CIA folks did heed some of the warnings and ramp up security. There was apparent lack of communication between the State Department and the CIA that was mentioned in this report. Is that what it was about?
Well, there was also a lack of communication between the CIA and the military. The military was U.S. Africa Command was prompted to respond in the wake of the attack on September 11th, and they sent these forces that took hours to get to their staging points, but they were unaware that there was the CIA annex where there were about 20 paramilitary contractors, some CIA staffers, who were responding to what was happening on the ground. Though the U.S. military was receiving point-by-point bulletins about what was happening, they were unaware that there was this large force on the ground in Benghazi. Also, so we have another instance here of the stovepiping of information. Remember back in 9/11, the FBI and the CIA were accused of having information that could have tipped them off, one of the other agencies, to the activities of the 9/11 hijackers, and yet they didn't share that information. Here, apparently, the information was there, it was being shared, but not enough was being done with that information to trigger further action.
Now, the report includes a timeline, the night of the incident. It actually states that there were 3 separate attacks, at least, in fewer than 8 hours, but could the U.S. have responded in time to prevent those deaths, given that it was spread out over 8 hours?
You know, Ty, we've been hearing from military officials over the last year that there was no way they could have responded in time for several reasons. And just this week, the House Armed Services Committee released 450 pages of transcripts of interviews and testimony that they got from senior military officials here at the Pentagon and at Africa Command, where they asked those same questions. Could the U.S. military have responded in time? And the answer was no. Number one, the planes were too far away. It would have taken them too long to get ramped up, to get on the flight lines to head over to Benghazi. And even if they're over Benghazi, what could they have done? Some congressmen said, well, you could have done a show of force. And you have the senior commander of Africa Command at the time, General Carter Ham, saying he did not agree with that notion because as far as he could tell, that would not have done much of anything. So what this report highlights here is, again, that we had this long episode, but at the time of this long attack, 3 separate attacks, like I said, but at the same time, the initial military response was about the attack on the consulate. 5 hours later is when we have the attack on the CIA annex. And so it would have been, you had separate events taking place here and not enough time for the military to respond in either one of them.
All right, Louis. ABC's Louis Martinez. We're actually going to head now to the State Department to get a briefing on this very issue. Thank you, Louis.
Similar attacks in the future. A number of the CISI recommendations are consistent with work the department has already undertaken to improve diplomatic security, including upgrading security cameras, improving fire protective equipment, and increasing Marine security guard presence. Of 12 unclassified recommendations directed to the State Department, 10 were previously issued by either the Benghazi ARB or the Best Practices Panel. And we can talk about some of the specifics in terms of the report, but in terms of a statement at the top, Deb, I'll turn it over to you.
Okay.
To lead the small crowd today.
Okay, we note that your fact sheet on all the things that you're doing in response to the review board.
Yep, has gone out.
One of the things that's not very similar to the review board's report is that it seems to call out Ambassador Stevens personally on a couple of his decisions. Apparently, the DoD confirmed to the Senate committee that twice they offered to help bolster his security force with troops from AFRICOM, but that he declined both times. It's on page 20 of the report.
Okay, I can check on that. I haven't seen that. I'll check on that specifically.
Okay.
On that specific, I mean, it's, again, the report just came out. We've looked at it. I haven't read the whole thing yet. I think in terms of security, whether it's for him specifically or for the different facilities, has been discussed exhaustively in the ARB and on Capitol Hill, but I'm happy to check on that specific one.
And haven't you looked at what he's done, what he did with security over that time period?
That's certainly part of what folks have looked at.
Yeah.
And I don't have anything new on that. Again, I'm happy to check on what the report specifically says.
Okay.
Again, it just came out.
Okay.
We're taking a look at it, but that issue has been discussed extensively. I'm happy to see if there's anything new on that.
So up until now, you really haven't seen anything that would indicate that he actually declined additional help and security?
I can check on that specific.
One of the premises of the report is that the attacks were preventable. Is that something that you concur with in the State Department?
Well, as we have repeatedly said, there was no specific threat indicating an attack was coming. Obviously, we've talked at length about the fact that we knew there were extremists and terrorists operating in Libya and in Benghazi. But again, we had no specific information indicating a threat, an attack was coming. We can't go back and look at the hypotheticals about what could have been prevented and what couldn't have. We have said that security needs to be improved. We've been crystal clear about that. That's why we're implementing the ARB recommendations and have already made a lot of progress, as you can see from the fact sheet we put out. But on this point, we have been crystal clear that there was no specific information that a threat was coming, and also that we don't believe, we have nothing to indicate there was significant pre-planning. So, hindsight is 20/20, I guess. But again, it doesn't, I think, serve a lot of purposes to go back and look through hypotheticals. Quite frankly, we can never answer. That's why we're committed to doing everything we can to prevent situations like this in the future.
But it did come in against a context where there'd already been an attack on the British mission. There'd been several attacks on other embassies and diplomatic personnel from different countries.
And we were very clear about the security situation there. We knew it was dangerous, as are many places we operate around the world. But that doesn't mean just because some place is dangerous that you have specific information or a specific threat that an attack is coming. You can only, you can act on threats and information you get. We knew the security situation was not good in Benghazi and in Libya, and that's why we had taken steps. But the ARB made clear that we could have done more with security. Nobody's saying we did everything right. Clearly, that's certainly not the case. But in terms of that specific question, I think that's where we are on that.
And what about the issue that there hasn't been, again from the Senate report, that there hasn't been enough kind of help and cooperation from the Libyan authorities in trying to find the people who were behind the attack?
Well, we work closely with the Libyan government, certainly on counterterrorism writ large. We talked about that a lot recently. And are pressing them to help us as much as possible. Let me check with our team to see in terms of cooperation and what that currently looks like. But the FBI is running the investigation into what happened. That's still ongoing. And we've said we're very committed to bringing to justice the perpetrators. This is hard. to do to find the folks responsible and bring them to justice, but we are absolutely committed to doing so, and we'll work with the Libyan government. I'm happy to check and see what the latest is on cooperation.
What about the 4 people I know that were disciplined, or 5 people that were disciplined as a result? I understand that a couple of them have been reassigned. Have they all been reassigned? Because if I remember, Eric Boswell had resigned, and then there were some reports that he was back at the State Department in another capacity.
Well, nothing's changed on that, I think, since we announced the outcome of the review. Let me check and see if I still have that in here. I think that I do. Just give me 1 second on that, Elise. I don't think anything's changed on that, but let me see. You're talking about the 4, correct? The 4 that we talked about.
Were there 4 and then Mr.
4
Boswell?
officials who were placed on administrative leave following the Independent Accountability Review Board's report. Let me see what I have here. Yes, going beyond the ARB's recommendations, the 4 were being reassigned to different positions within the department without the same responsibilities they had on the day of the attack. So we announced months ago the Secretary had finished the review of the status of the 4, and again, they are not in positions with the same responsibilities they had on the day of the attack.
And that includes Eric Boswell? Because he resigned from his position, if I remember correctly.
I don't know if we talked about specific people. Yeah, I mean, I understand that was part of it, but again, the 4 were just reassigned to different positions. They don't have the same responsibilities they had at the time of the attack.
And just one more thing from the report. Sorry, Leslie. It says like one of the key findings is that I understand that there was no specific and imminent threat to the consulate, but there was a warning provided by the intelligence community that the security situation in eastern Libya was deteriorating and that U.S. facilities and personnel were at risk.
That is a fairly not atypical warning that we say about a number of places we operate overseas. That's not specific to anything. Clearly, look, we've been clear that we could have done more with security, that we need to improve our security. I don't want to make it sound like just because there wasn't, well, let me finish, just because there wasn't a specific threat that we were not taking security seriously, or we think that we shouldn't have done more. Clearly that's the case. But that is the kind of security warning, quite frankly, you could say about a number of places.
Well, I understand, but I'm talking about connecting the dots between...
Well, there have to be dots to connect.
Well, connecting the dots between here is a warning and not saying you're saying that, but the people that are making the decisions saying, oh, well, we hear that about a lot of places, and not taking the necessary measures to beef up security in relation to that specific warning.
And what I'm saying is we have said in the ARB and the State Department have said that we should have beefed up security and done things differently.
As a result of those warnings.
As a result of the ARB's investigation into what happened. A variety of pieces of information, right? So as a result of the situation, we have said we need to get better at doing security. We should have been better then, and we need to get better going forward. What I am saying is it was about the question about this being able to be prevented, right? Yes, we should have beefed up security, but you asked about connecting dots. There have to be dots to connect, and that there was no specific threat that an attack was coming, and we have nothing to indicate that this involves significant pre-planning. That doesn't mean we shouldn't have been better at security. Of course we should have. But this notion that there was one piece of information that if people had just... I know, but let me just... Some people have. So this notion that there was just one piece of information, if we had listened to it, we could have prevented this, I think is an appealing theory to some people, but just isn't borne out by the facts. It's just not.
Does the report...
All right, we've been listening to the State Department briefing responding to the newly released Senate intelligence report about the attack in Benghazi. Let's bring back Louis Martinez at the Pentagon for his reaction to what we've been hearing from the State Department. Louis, nothing new here. The State Department received a lot of criticism in that report, but obviously they are firing back, saying there was no significant pre-planning in terms of this attack and that there was no specific warning that the attack was coming. Does this borne out in that intelligence report?
That's actually one thing that the Senate intelligence report does say, is that there was no specific threat on September 11, 2012, threatening the U.S. mission in Benghazi. But the report does say, like we talked about earlier, Ty, it talks about those tripwires, that there had been a trend of violence growing in Benghazi that should have heightened the awareness of State Department officials back here in Washington, as well as the Ambassador Chris Stevens, who died in that attack. And what we're hearing from Marie Harf the spokesperson there at the State Department, is that the State Department has implemented the recommendations from another blue ribbon panel, the ARB as it's called, that put forth 29 recommendations about how to boost security. You hear her talking about how if we had a threat, we would have boosted security. That's, in hindsight, one of the things that we could have done. But she's acknowledging there was no threat, but the Intelligence Committee saying there was a pattern there that should have heightened awareness that they needed to raise security just in case.
Okay. Now, Louis, does the report specify in detail the backing behind this attack? Do they get into that aspect of it?
They talk about the local militias being involved, of course. We were hearing that from several investigations, the one on the House side, and of course even from the State Department itself just last week, talking about one of those groups, Ansar al-Sharia, which was one of the militias there inside Benghazi, which the State Department has targeted as a terrorist organization, saying that, you know, we don't have any new indications that they were specifically involved or the only group involved in the 9/11 attacks in 2012, but that we know that they had a role, and so they're looking out to broaden that investigation. You heard Marie talking about how the FBI is still the lead on this, and they're trying to figure out who was behind it, behind the attack. But that's proving to be very difficult because the FBI, of course, doesn't have a presence on the ground in Benghazi, and it's easier for some reporters to get in touch with militia leaders reputed to have been involved in the attack than it is for American law enforcement, or even, for that matter, Libyan security officials.
Interesting. And let's talk about one of the other sort of key components to come out of this report, which was the location of the CIA compound right at that site. Apparently, not everyone had known that the CIA compound was there, yet at the same time, the CIA seemed to be aware that, not that an attack was imminent, but that things were growing more dangerous and had taken more security precautions. So can you go over those 2 points made in the report?
Sure. One thing to clarify, though, the CIA annex is actually about a mile southeast of where the Benghazi consulate compound was. That was a facility housing about 20 CIA contractors, CIA officers, mainly tasked with gathering intelligence in Benghazi and also gathering information about where those portable portable shoulder-fired missiles may have been. Libya had thousands upon thousands of these missiles, and that was a key CIA mission. But they were also there to establish contacts with the militias. Well, the report talks about how the military wasn't aware that that CIA facility was there, didn't realize how large it was, didn't realize that they were sending a force over to try to reinforce the diplomatic security agents that had been overrun at the consulate. That's one thing that's raised in the report. And the other thing was that you have this pattern of violence that we talked about. The two attacks on the consulate itself, one in April, another one in June, that should have heightened awareness within the State Department. But it did for the CIA because they ramped up security as a result of those two attacks. You also have the trend in violence at other diplomatic facilities in Benghazi, other Western targets in Benghazi. The CIA responded to that. The report notes that Ambassador Chris Stevens supported the State Department's notion of switching away from a military team that had been providing temporary security in Tripoli, not in Benghazi, in Tripoli, and that they wanted to rely on local security forces, which is what they ended up doing in Benghazi. Now, the report notes that Carter Ham, who was the general of Africa Command, had offered on 2 occasions to Stevens, you know what, I can offer you additional military forces if you want them, and Stevens said no. So there's a lot of blame being spread around here in the Senate Intel report.
And Louis, finally, any more fallout or changes we can expect now that the report has been released?
Well, we're hearing now the initial response from Marie Harf at the State Department. She's talking about how the report's just come out, and so they don't really have much to comment on the specifics. But what they do talk about are how the recommendations of that blue ribbon panel have been implemented, and we're getting the same language from Jay Carney with the president, saying that it's his sense that we're hearing more of the same about what we've heard over the last year, that there were some security gaps in Benghazi, but that the changes have been implemented to try to prevent this from happening again.
All right, ABC's Louis Martinez, thank you again at the Pentagon for joining us. And you can, of course, get a complete recap right here on abcnews.com and continue to watch that State Department briefing stream live. For now, I'm Ty Hernandez in New York, and this has been an ABC News Digital Special Report.